For this example, we're looking at a survey that was conducted of college students and asked which social platform most influenced their online shopping. And you can see that here we're given a table of those results. You'll notice that the table that we're looking at is not the raw data from the actual survey, but instead it would be the summarized data. Specifically, this is going to be the frequency data that was collected from the survey. Remember, a frequency table gives us the particular counts, the total counts for each one of these categories by platform. And in this case, we've subdivided it into males and females. What if I asked you, however, to calculate for me by hand the relative frequency from this summarized table? Let's practice that before we move on. We know that if I wanted to talk about a relative frequency, that's going to be the proportion with which each category occurred. In order to create a proportion or a fractional amount for each of the categories, I first need to add up how many total females answered this survey. So when I total up all the females who answered the survey, I get 1,114. So on this next column, I'm going to add in that we're going to look at the relative frequency for the females. And the relative frequency is going to go back to each of the categories. So I'm going to look at the Facebook. There were 222 responses for Facebook out of the total 1114. Divide that into your calculator using your calculator, and you get 0.199. Let's complete that for the remaining 5 categories. So for Instagram, I get 535 divided by 1114, which would be 0.480. 29 divided by 1114, which is going to be 0.026. 57 divided by 1114, which is 0.051. And finally, 271 divided by the 1114, which is going to be 0.243. So relative frequency is telling me the proportion of females that answered each category. We can see here approximately 20% of the females said Facebook influences their shopping, whereas only 2.5% said Snapchat influences their shopping. That's how we would go about calculating by hand a relative frequency for a summarized table, which is what you would have to do by hand. StatCrunch isn't going to be able to do it for you. Now, moving on to how would I graphically display this? In this particular example, we want to create a side-by-side bar graph. Now, we've already said that bar graphs are going to be the type of graph we look at for qualitative data when I want to compare two things to each other. So let's walk through the steps on how to create a side-by-side bar graph using StatCrunch. Here you see the same table that we were looking at on the previous screen. In the center of my screen right here, I have my platform for the social media influencers, followed by males who responded and females who responded. And what I would like to see is a side-by-side graph so that I could compare females to males by category. So the special way that we would do a side-by-side bar graph is going to be in the graph section, but instead of choosing bar plot for a side-by-side bar graph, I'm actually going to go to chart. So from chart, we select columns, and I want to select both male and female columns. It's not necessary to do anything after that if we just want to create the graph, but let's look and see what that graph looks like, and we may want to come back and edit something in a moment. So I don't need to select anything else within this pop-up screen. I'm going to go ahead and click compute, and now you can see that I have a side-by-side graph for respondents. The red's going to be females, the males are going to be, and blue is going to be males. Let's go back and add a few things to this because, for one, I'm a little old-fashioned. I am used to seeing bar graphs that are vertical as opposed to being horizontal. So I want to change the orientation, and I may want to add a label on here so that I know exactly what column 1 represents. Which one is column 1 or graph 1? Is that the Facebook platform, Snapchat? I can't remember, so I'm going to go ahead and add some of that stuff. So let's go to Edit. Then we're going to go down here to the labels. Let's put the labels in. Now the labels were the platform that we were looking at. And instead of, let's look at the plot here. Instead of me looking at it as horizontally split bars, let's change that to vertical split bars. When I hit compute this time, it's the orientation I'm most familiar with looking at, and I can now clearly identify underneath each one of those bar graphs which platform we happen to be talking about. Now, the advantage to doing bar graphs again is so that I can compare categories to each other, and in particular, in this case, I can actually compare the subcategories of males versus females. You'll notice that when we're talking about bar graphs, our graph is going to be able to give us an estimation when I'm comparing two to each other. So let's look specifically at the Twitter responses right here. We can see that blue represents male, red represents females. And if I wanted to kind of summarize that, I might say that you're twice as likely to choose Twitter if you're a male than you are female. So within the Twitter platform, males are twice as likely to choose Twitter as an influencer as opposed to females. Whereas if we look here at Instagram, you can clearly see that for Instagram, females are more likely to choose Instagram than there are males. So a side-by-side comparison is an easy way for us to compare these two subcategories to each other. And furthermore, bar graphs in general allow us to compare categories to each other. One more display I would like to point out to you, because I've seen more and more of these displays starting to pop up in various media and things that I've looked at. So let's go back to Edit. I'm going to look at Plot here. And instead of split bars, I'm going to look at stacked bars. And let's see what that looks like. So these are the stacked bars. And the difference between a split and a stacked bar has to do with we need to interpret the entire bar as all the respondents from that category. So if I'm looking here at the Instagram category, we can see that the red portion of the bar is greater than, it's taking up more space of the overall bar than the blue height of the bar. So in other words, females are more likely to choose Instagram as influencers than males. Another thing that it helps us to identify is if I want to compare, I'm going to choose the none category down here. If I look at the overall category for none, I can see that males are almost, so this bar right here, the height of the blue bar, looks like it's around 3/4 or 2/3 of the way up. So I would say maybe that males are maybe 2/3 or 3/4 more likely to choose nothing than females. So when you're looking at stacked bars like this, the total height of the bar is how much is in that one particular category. And if you compare, you're actually comparing the proportion of one segment to the other segment. And that's how we would look at both side by side as well as stacked bar graphs.